starts with a TikTok. Taken at the popular consumer electronics show hosted in Las Vegas every January, the video shows an AI-based anti-cheating software being showcased by Samsung. Known as Prober, the video shows a student taking a test with the software analysing their movements and flagging certain moves as abnormal. That TikTok went viral with over 1.6 million views to date and prompted a deluge of comments and articles about the cost and potential bias of such systems. So if even TikTok is talking about EdTech in 2022, is this the year that the topic is really going to come to the forefront of big tech brands' minds and strategies? Joining us today to discuss this topic, as well as exactly what we mean by the EdTech industry and why we're seeing such growth, is Ben Clayson, CEO of VICTVS, and Geoff Chapman, industry expert who has years of experience working with EdTech companies and exam owners alike. Geoff co-founded World Exam Tech, the journal for assessment executives and investors, as well as founding his own platform, Actor Education, that brings together exam owners and markers. He's a frequent blog poster and social media commentator on all things EdTech, so we're really delighted to welcome him today. So thanks for being here, Geoff.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So yeah, like I said, this whole thing starts with the TikTok that I saw a couple of weeks ago. So what are the big tech companies doing in this space in terms of EdTech or assessment tech?
A lot of the big brands that we know and love, Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, AWS, Microsoft, that they've all had their own certification exams for a number of years now, obviously delivered internationally. And that IT sector was really at the forefront, or one of the pioneers of moving exams on screen, and then into test centres and then to remote proctoring or remote invigilation. But are they really engaged in the assessment space? Well, assessments, as we know around the table, it's very heavily regulated. It's very emotive as well. A lot of people have something to say about assessment. Nearly everybody's been through some sort of education system. It's interesting because those brands, you'd expect them to make a big play in education, and in some instances they have through the hardware. Others, as you say, in terms of TikTok and the more recent ones, yes, they're taking a look at it, but are they actually pushing their own education programs? Some of the hardware guys, that's what they did back in the day for their IT cert programs. Basically, it was a way of shifting kit. So you're using that education program to basically have those sponsors, those advocates within a corporate to say, we could do with a new Windows Server edition, and we need the education program to back that up. So a way of evangelizing, if you like, through an organization to buy more kit. There are exceptions, but that's mainly what they were involved with.
Making them deliberately confusing, so to force people to have to buy these training programs from them.
That's an interesting point of view. I think it's part of a multi-pronged strategy. Obviously, when you look at the different, how they call them, channels to market or routes to market, one would be getting certain kit through your big box providers, getting it through certain other distribution channels, consumer channels as well. And education is one of those. Obviously, school market, university markets, they buy kit. So this is one efficient route to market, if you will.
And who would be the evangelists that you are talking about in terms of within organisations for these types of things?
Pretty much your CTO, anybody who's involved with that procurement process to buy new kit or is responsible for the refresh of that kit normally. Obviously, if your organisation is more historically more of a tech bent, if that makes sense, if you're more into that technology side of things, you will have other stakeholders wanting to know what's going on. So obviously your FD would be interested, but also from an L&D point of view, if your organisation is heavily regulated, say in financial services, and you're trying to move into more modern technology platforms, perhaps for you're trying to automate certain back office processes, then of course you're going to have a stake in what's being bought as well.
But am I right in thinking it's mainly kind of IT professionals who are engaging in these training programs, and that there's a degree of sort of value to these qualifications, as in they are career qualifications that then can help people access better or different working opportunities? Yes
is a short answer. The gender balance has always been a bit out of kilter as well. You go to any of the big tech providers' education conferences, and it's 95% at least male. It's very stark when you see that gender imbalance. But the programs themselves, they are genuinely worldwide. You can be anywhere in the world and follow that path, depending on what you want to do. If you want to be a database writer, if you want to work in that field, then you can follow Oracle's path no matter where you are in the world. And obviously, the assessment follows that. What we are seeing is organizations that are trying to look at different ways of assessing rather than just pure theoretical exams. So you have had organizations looking at simulation where an actual task is on a server somewhere, and whoever that learner is, they'll be actually go into that environment and solve a problem actually on there. So that has certain technology demands, and I think that's part of the solution. It won't be the entire thing, but it will be a mixed economy in that respect. The type of assessment, if you think of the assessment toolkit, if you will, simulations or portfolios of work, they'll be in there with the theoretical tests. But I think it's only relatively recently where enough learners and enough places have that infrastructure to deliver.
Carly, can you tell us a bit more about the video that appeared on TikTok and describe what was going on?
Yeah,
tell us about what
absolutely. So like I said, it was a guy that's obviously attending CES in Las Vegas, which is is the world's largest kind of showcase from big tech providers of all of their new stuff. And Samsung each year does a sort of innovation incubator where they feature obviously things that they've plucked from around the world from different sectors. And Proba, or I'm presuming that's how you pronounce it, was showcased. And the video showed a student sat at their desk at a computer, ostensibly taking an exam. There was then an overlay, which was AI-based, that was monitoring their head movements, their body movements. And in the video, the guy kind of leaned back from his desk and looked like he might be looking over someone's shoulder. A big thing flagged up on screen that shouted abnormal. And it's interesting because the guy in the TikTok obviously was saying cheaters beware.
So it's very much part of this whole trying to use tech to prevent cheating and malpractice in an examination.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the commenters on that video itself, and then obviously it's been picked up by the wider media, are saying, why are organisations paying for a technology like this when really they should be investing that money in the education itself rather than, paying for a big piece of technology that's just there to help prevent cheating.
Yeah, so I've got a question for you, Geoff, based on your experience and that description. And yourself, Carly, too. Do we think that the majority of candidates are trying to cheat their way through exams and therefore need every aspect of their body language and movement and behaviour and eye movement and so on to be tracked and analysed by effectively a robot? Or is this perhaps looking at the problem from a completely distorted perspective, and perhaps what the commentators are saying is actually the legitimate point, which is that perhaps the quality of the education experience, the quality of the assessment experience ought to be the principal consideration, and is the tech better suited to being a tool that supports people as they go through assessments?
It's really interesting because the rate of change in technology far outstrips the rate of change within education and assessment, and so you do have that imbalance. Also, as well, the communities that are trying to be served, very, very different for lots of different reasons. There are certain cultures where there's a lot more emphasis placed on high-stakes exams than others. So if there's a lot of pressure to achieve in a cliff-face exam, as they call it, then, of course, it will lead itself to certain behaviours. So all that's not new, but I think what is new is when you start to push through, and again, the pandemic's been a classic example of this, where we've tried to push technology to solve an issue, exam delivery, and it's only worked to a certain extent. I think the industry hasn't done a great job in getting that message across to those communities to say how things have changed, how we're doing proctoring and invigilation differently. You are pushing that responsibility onto the candidate. Whereas the previous service encounter will be just turn up and sit down. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're changing that to do your room scan, make sure everything's locked down, that is a big burden, and not everybody can cope with that, especially in an exam situation where you're under enough stress anyway trying to perform. Having all that responsibility pushed onto you is probably not a great recipe for a good outcome, I would say. So I think the industry's got to be a lot better in not just communicating that and through PR and everything else, but to say there are different ways, there are different techniques to help that in a high stakes environment. But to what you said, Ben, harking back to something I said a little while ago, that assessment toolkit isn't always held up under the microscope to see if it's actually any good and if it's appropriate. You will get a lot of assessment owners, exam owners saying, well, of course, high stakes exams are the best measurement tool because look at all the research behind them. Well, of course, an assessment owner would say that if they're delivering a lot of high stakes exams for sure. But let's look at some of those other things in the toolkit. I mean, in terms of big tech players, Carly, you've got people like Sony who've they've got a blockchain product for schools and universities, and the Ministry of Education runs the annual Global Math Challenge in Japan for that, and you've got kind of 250,000 learners going through that. But that is technology now. Here we are in 2022. That's relatively established in lots of different sectors. It's used in fintech, in medical. It's used in plenty of places, but nobody's really talking about those tools that are in the toolkit because they're claiming, quote unquote, there's no evidence behind them, even though you've got lots of usage cases right around the world. When something happens at CES, it doesn't necessarily play back to the assessment sphere in Western Europe. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think one of the interesting things about the video is it highlights that kind of focus on the tech. And obviously it's in a tech exhibition, so that makes sense. But I think it's interesting that you have big tech names, Microsoft and Google and Amazon and others providing certification schemes for all sorts of different qualifications. Then looking at the assessment experience itself, like you're saying, Geoff, people get stressed, people get really anxious about exams, technical problems such as internet connectivity and so on can exacerbate that. And it seems to me that the idea of reliance on an overlaid box that will suddenly flash up an alert saying this is abnormal, it doesn't, to my mind, really kind of do anything to allay any of those anxieties. It's the kind of referring back to the very uniquely human experience of having to go through a high stakes assessment. I'm not sure, or I'm not convinced at this point that that's adequately met by algorithms.
No, and I think the interesting thing about the whole thing is that as much as saying sort of CES is like a tech-focused show, which of course is actually very widely recognised, and it's reported in kind of normal media, not just kind of specific media as well. Right. So that's what really interested me about this fact that it's like going onto TikTok, which people see as maybe like stupid or facile or something, or not, but it's obviously the most popular platform that there is at the moment. So I think it's incredibly interesting that that topic is even being focused on that platform. And I think it's indicative of a wider kind of trend that people are thinking more about examinations. They're thinking more about how they're being watched or assessed. And, when they are taking examinations.
I get so frustrated when I see reports published that try to talk about malpractice and they talk about what's being done. And we all know that different tools are being used by learners to conduct malpractice and other people within that ecosystem. And then you get a report published that says, we should ban watches from the exam hall. Well, guys, we've got to do better than that. We've got to understand the whole vista of not just what's being used, but how you educate somebody to say, if this happens, then the exam itself will, if it's got no confidence in the wider community, then there's no point in running the exam. If you're going to an employer and with a certain exam, and that exam has been in the press around cheating and everything else, they're going, well, is it actually worth anything? So if there's no confidence in the exam, then the whole system comes crumbling down. It's all about confidence, and I don't feel confident when I see those reports that say ban watches. I think it needs to be a much deeper and wider review of how not just prevention but also education, not just learners as well. This isn't their fault. This is more to do with the environment in which the learning's taking place. It's about the educators and the other people who've got stakes in that whole assessment arena.
Yeah, I think that something that's often overlooked in relation to professional exams is that there's this big focus on learners and their malpractice and people cheating, individuals cheating, when the reality is that professional training providers, of which there are thousands in the UK alone, they arguably have more of an interest in being engaged in nefarious activities like trying to get copies of exam questions and so on, because they actually have a ready market of people that may pay to get those resources from them. Individual candidates may cheat, and there will always be a small percentage of people that want to try and gain an advantage. But is that where the really kind of commercial activity is going, and is focusing on just the learners actually really kind of missing the point? Is it to me, it seems like a risk assessment that's gone a bit askew.
That's a really good point. I mean, Panorama, the UK current affairs programme, did a big expose on English testing about 3 or 4 years ago now. And that's what happens. Basically, you've got those training providers who have an interest in a good outcome, quote unquote. So it's driving the wrong behaviours. Now, if I'm a candidate and I'm turning up for a test and somebody's at the front saying number 17 is B, on 18 is this, then you're thinking, oh, well, if everybody else is doing it, it's classic cohort behaviour. If somebody else is doing it, well, this seems to be acceptable. Why am I doing it? Why would I be the wrong one out? So, it's, I think, again, through the pandemic and even beforehand, where you've seen instructor-led training move to more of a home learning environment, that could be a catalyst for change, for really pushing that responsibility back onto the learner. You remember when I talked about pushing the responsibility in terms of remote invigilation? I think in the training aspect, that could be interesting as well, where you're communicating with peers online. You're able to access different advice around a subject, no matter where it is in the world, not just your tutor at the private training centre, but you probably want to engage deeper because you've got that community and you're able to access mastery level knowledge and understanding of a subject as well, which is great. If you get somebody engaged in a subject and they want to pursue it, I mean, that's gold dust for anybody who owns a qualification program, an education program. That is real cradle to grave. So I think that move from instructor-led to more home-based, I think that's really, really interesting.
So, Carly, you've got personal experience of this situation of having to deal with learning at home and then undertaking an assessment yourself. And exactly as Geoff's talking about, you had the responsibility of going through that, setting up and dealing with the monitoring personally. So my question is, when you're doing that in an exam, how does it feel? Because to me, it feels, and I haven't got experience of it like yourself, but to me, it feels a bit like an extension of the whole surveillance society sort of situation. Now, I understand there's a requirement for monitoring people during an assessment, a high-stakes exam, but how does it feel when you, as a learner candidate, suddenly have to take on the responsibility for monitoring yourself in that particular situation?
Yeah, I think it's, personally, I found the experience quite frustrating because when it doesn't go right, it's, like I said, the onus is on me as the learner to fix it. So in my case, it was I didn't have the right webcam or something like that. It's a very specific piece of technology that I needed that I didn't have. So that delayed my exam by a few days or something. And obviously then when you're taking exam, as you said, you're kind of quite emotional. It's an emotive experience. You're building up. You've kind of prepped for that exact hour or that that exact day that you're going to take the exam. And then when it doesn't happen because of something that feels quite out of your own control, even though you think you've read all of the instructions and followed everything, for then a disembodied voice on a computer screen to tell me, oh no, you can't do it today, it's incredibly frustrating. And it definitely knocks you off your course in terms of how prepared you feel for the exam. And definitely in my experience, then the next time I went into it, my hackles were up. I was quite combative going into the situation because I was like, I'm determined to do the exam this time, which probably wasn't a very nice experience for the invigilator that I was working with, because I was already going in with kind of a bad attitude, I guess, because I'd already had a bad experience. So maybe that wasn't fair on them, but it must be something that people who do online invigilation must experience all the time. It's just the frustration of candidates when things don't go their way. And especially, you know, the exam I was taking was nothing to do with technology.
Yeah.
So why should I be expected as a learner to know, to be able to follow some quite detailed specifications for technology when the exam I was doing was on a totally unrelated topic?
I mean, who looks at the instruction booklet for when you get a new phone?
Exactly.
Nobody.
Exactly.
You've got to ensure the servicing count is reflective of what people are used to, what your learners and candidates are used to. And if they're used to, well, it should be plug and play or get yourself up and running in 30 seconds. You need to have solutions that play to that rather than play against people. No wonder you're going to get people feeling antagonistic, people feeling upset if they're having to wade through something goes completely against what they're used to, for sure.
Exactly. Is that something you think is indicative of the industry then, that it's not quite at that intuitive plug and play style, both for assessment tech and for kind of the EdTech platforms
Spot
out
on.
there?
Absolutely spot on, yeah. I shouldn't beat these guys over the head too much, but
feel free.
It's but it is an entirely different servicing counter. When you look at some of the public domain commentary around that switch from regular invigilation to remote proctoring, some of those providers will say, well, we didn't, our clients weren't asking for it and we didn't invest much in it, and you're making a lot of these excuses as to why they didn't pivot quickly enough and effectively. It's upsetting in a lot of ways because you can see it coming, but still you didn't do anything. And that's trying to turn the tank around, in a corporate sense. Yeah, absolutely. That's what happens if you're of a certain size. But basically that pushes all that stress onto your learners, and that shouldn't be happening. Professional PR, plug and play products, designing something from the ground up, which, again, I hate to repeat myself on this, but you've got to have user forums. There's one very big school exam board in England that's only just recently started with a candidate forum, actually talking to people who take the exams, because they're providing a service. All of their revenue is for this service, but they never spoke to the actual kids who are taking the exams. I mean, how nuts is that? It's just unbelievable. Every exam owner should have that sort of information coming to them on a regular scheduled basis. In any other business, if you weren't getting user feedback, you'd be out the door. That's marketing 101.
Yeah, I think it's the scale of high stakes exams globally, and the fact that historically you've got candidates who are obviously key stakeholders who seem to be given less sort of opportunity to have constructive input into the experience, and then the lockdowns and remote proctoring requires them to be involved, but they were not used to it. Now things are changing again, so we're looking at candidates potentially coming back into centres. So how does that then work in terms of candidates taking responsibility for anything? Are they supposed to just hand back over responsibility? Because I don't think that will work very well, because I think the video on TikTok, but particularly the comments, is indicative of what you were saying, Carly, about these people paying attention now to the quality of their own experience, and rightly so, because most of them are paying for it.
Absolutely, yeah. Again, when you see a lot of the stories, here we are in February 22, and your UK cost of living, you're going through the roof, inflation. In terms of disposable income, a lot of people were saying, look, this is very, very valuable. It's a big chunk of my disposable income that I'm spending on my own education. I want a good service for it, comparable to what I'm used to in other environments. And if they do start to go back to the test centres and they start to see that cognitive dissonance, if you like, of good service versus bad service, they're going to ask questions. And with social media, they've got the voice now to start really not just discussing it, but to really going hammer and tongs, as they say. So again, are exam owners set up to handle that? Are they set up to articulate themselves through social media? I don't see any evidence of that, to be quite frank.
Yeah, so the technology's there, it's available, it's great, it does really interesting things, but like any tool, it sort of depends very much on the users. I think that was my kind of takeaway from that video. over focus on technology kind of leaves
Oh.
a big gaping hole.
Absolutely, because like I said, it's easy for us. We're in the industry, we know kind of what's out there, but an AI monitoring technology isn't new. You know, it's not new. It's not a new piece of technology, either as a piece of technology for other applications or in the assessment industry. However, what is new is the fact that it's being showcased on a very public platform. So I want to roll it back slightly. We're all in the assessment industry. We kind of know what it means. But I want to help explain that for other people. So what would you say is the EdTech, the assessment industry? Who's working in it? What are we actually looking at?
It's what can I say? A great industry to be in. It's been a bit of a privilege to work for it as many years as I have. I think in terms of what the catalyst is, obviously the internet is the big driver for it. But also as well, reach. And by that I mean organisations that want to be the voice of their industry. They may own an exam, they may own education programs, but they want to influence policy. They want to spread their wings internationally, and internet-delivered assessments and education is a method to do that. So I mentioned before about the IT sector, but also financial services, the medical profession, those sectors that have certain demands. So in the medical sector, if there's a shortage of a particular profession, then you can use the education program to plug that gap. If I'm a medical organization in one of the GCC Middle East countries, I can set up an education program that can ensure that people who are coming from other countries like Sri Lanka and Philippines to work are of the standard that I'm looking for. So it fulfills that particular gap, if you like, that particular need. In terms of what the technology play, I mean, it's interesting. It's the old cliche of if you hang around long enough, you see the technology come back, twice, maybe even three times. So things such as internet delivered tests, you're talking 20 plus years where that's been possible and have been done. But as the infrastructure globally has caught up, then people like me will say, well, we could have been doing this for a long time ago, but for lots of different reasons, it was never done. We mentioned at the start about education and assessment being very emotive. Lots of people not just have a say, but lots of stakeholders to look after as well. So when you see a piece of research like what Ofqual did with YouGov last year, that they said, well, if you're looking at delivering school tests online, who the people or the groups of people that would like that or wouldn't like that, and the research showed that head teachers were the people who were most against that. So even though the technology exists and you've got practice in lots of different sectors around the world, even within Western Europe and the UK, those stakeholders still need to be convinced for lots of different reasons. So if I'm a head teacher, do I want exams delivered off-site where I don't have that control over my own kingdom, if you like, from my own school or my own academy chain? Those questions aren't being asked at the moment. Obviously, we talk about students and teachers themselves will have to undergo certain tests before they become fully qualified. But for heads, that's something which is still got to be debated. It still needs to be convinced about why it's beneficial for not just my school, but also my pupils and also the people who work for me. Again, I don't think the sector's done a great job in reaching out to people like that and explaining how it works outside the school arena. Now, whether that's down to the vendors or whether that's down to unions or government, I think it's a mix of them. It's probably because nobody wants to take a very sharp thistle, if you see what I mean. They don't want to grasp that thistle right at the moment. But I think there's an understanding that there are certain groups of people who say it's still yet to be convinced about this. So I think that's where some of those blockers to rolling out the technology and the new solutions are coming from.
So I would suggest that the effects of lockdown has been a kind of rapid acceleration of certainly the consideration, if not the adoption of technology-based solutions to kind of assessing people. And then, you've kind of got people being forced to look at things differently and trying to find different ways of delivery for assessments because perhaps they're revenue kind of depends on those assessments. But in terms of education, kind of endpoint assessment or sort of high stakes assessment really has changed very little since the sort of industrial revolution. And it's interesting to consider whether my generation, which began with no internet whatsoever and then suddenly had an internet at the age of 16, which was great, and subsequent generations that are digital natives, for want of a better sort of descriptor, as they kind of grow and then turn into senior leaders in different industries, all the ones that you mentioned, and plus so many others, it's likely, I think, that they're going to be much more receptive to those kind of technology first technology-driven things like assessments that have traditionally been a bit more manual and a bit more traditional. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, on the ground, in schools, they'll be using a lot of different kits for different things. Whether it's basic programming with Purple Mash or different devices for recording media, and there comes a certain point where they go, you've got to put the tech down and learn how to write for 3 hours. For me, that's the kind of cliff face. For me, that's the moment that we need to change. You have to learn a different skill for a very short period of time, and once you go into the workplace, that skill really isn't needed. And you think, well, it's serving the system. It's not serving the learner's journey. It's not actually serving the qualification in some respects because of that manual piece that you mentioned.
On yesterday instead.
It's like the standard thing of when you're at school, your teacher's like, well, you won't have a calculator forever. And now everybody has a high-powered scientific calculator in their phone at all times. That's so you don't need to learn how to do trigonometry.
No, and I regularly do long division.
Absolutely. I think I had to Google how to do long division the other day.
Yeah, I'm impressed that you needed to.
I think, as you said, Ben, that the pandemic has, if not changed attitudes, and it's shone a very harsh light on current practice and what's bad about it and why it's so divergent from all of the assessment that has gone either on screen or online. And I did mention in the blog quite recently that it's becoming harder to find examinations that haven't been pushed online. If I'm a small membership body and part of how I get members is for them to sit an exam to prove they've got mastery of what I'm into. Those smaller guys don't necessarily want to be investing in big analog solutions if there's something which can be bought relatively easily in a digital form and able to be dispersed or sold worldwide, then that's a real boon for me as a small organisation. Don't have big startup costs. I'm not having to rely on couriers sending papers everywhere. That plays to how I look after my business, how I look after my members. So if I'm able to reach my members through various different online platforms, it would seem a bit strange for me to say, and in order to be a member, you've got to fill in a big bunch of papers and sit an exam with a big bunch of paper as well. Do you see what I mean? It's that cognitive dissonance, or it's what's wrong with this picture? Why are you trying to shoehorn an analog process into my digital world?
I think that brings me on to something I wanted to ask you, which is about the kind of market in general. Are we talking about a few big players in terms of EdTech and assessment tech, or is there a kind of long tail at the end of it? What does it look like?
Sure. I mean, it's a generally global sector, which is great. There's lots of examples of good practice, scale, innovation. It's sometimes unfortunate that the people who make policy decisions don't recognise that. But when you look at the numbers behind it and who are we serving, I mean, if you include universities, you're looking around about 34,000 organisations that run a high-stakes exam around the world. They're generally served in the EdTech or assessment space, if you will. About 160, 170 organisations that will say, we provide test software, a platform for high stakes. So that includes you're authoring the tests, delivering them, and obviously the reporting on the back end. And obviously the pandemic's really brought to bear the people who do remote invigilation, and there are about 90, almost 100 of those organisations that are into that. They are generally global. organisations in America, in the UK, Netherlands, India. I think what's interesting is that from, again, speaking as a Brit, there's more of a realisation now that we do export assessment, and we do rather successfully. So, I mean, again, for the numbers, you're probably looking around about 40 million exams delivered in the UK, but we export a further 11 million. So to me, that says that UK education actually resonates in lots of places around the world. And I think it's important that as we're trying to win over people in the bigger general qualifications market, that we bring that success story to bear. We don't talk about that success for lots of different reasons, which I often find very difficult to fathom. For UK PLC to have that sort of export is a really big success story. Whether it's an organisation in a country that wants to develop its own program but needs expertise to say, how do you set up a qualification program, an education program, to basically bringing in a Brit on the supplier side to say, we want to run remote invigilation. Can you do it for us, because we know you guys are good? So I think it's a great success story in that respect. I think what the pandemic has helped with as well is plug into some of those trends. The assessment sector does lend itself to the gig economy in lots of ways, whether it's remote invigilation or item writers or psychometricians, the people who analyse how exams are performing. So it does lend itself to what's going on in wider society. This isn't all about, we hope, stuffy 9 to 5 in big bad offices in plenty of places. I think the irony is that a lot of exams are still delivered by those sorts of organisations, those 9 to 5 big places. I think it'll be interesting once we get through the pandemic in terms of, will those organisations change, or are we going to see a new wave of organisations who can do it better using different techniques, as we've discussed, being able to discuss and talk about the different items in the assessment toolkit, deliver a better experience, but also deliver it quicker and probably with a better price point as well to the learner.
When we're talking about the scale of the industry, how many people are we actually talking about here, both sort of UK, internationally?
Oh, crikey. I mean, yeah, that's a hell of a question. In terms of the supply base within assessment, you're looking at a value around between 8 to 10 billion. But what makes the people calculation difficult is the nature of how exams are made and delivered, the whole gig economy, the proctors, the item writers, the markers. These aren't 9 to 5 people. I mean, the great irony is that a lot of those big exam programs are still owned by organisations in the 9 to 5 old stuffy offices environments. I think what we're going to see, a new wave of organisation that is able to look at new techniques, proven techniques from around the world, and pull together a better assessment toolkit that doesn't negatively impinge on learners, but helps them perform to the best of their ability, rather than going through the old ways, which have got a ton of research behind them. Those new wave of organisations will be able to deploy a lot quicker, be able to create assessment which is more meaningful, but also deliver it with a better price point. It's hard to pin a tail on how many people are employed if you want to use employed in the traditional sense. That expertise, that UK expertise is really cherished, and I think that should be leveraged a lot more in terms of what we could be doing, not just outside the UK, but to improve what we already do.
So let's dive specifically into remote invigilation, or remote proctoring as it's known in the US. As we've already discussed today, the pandemic was a huge driver in the growth of that market. Do you want to tell me a bit more about what we're seeing there?
The way of delivering exams is, traditionally, it's been around for hundreds and thousands of years. The Chinese civil service exams are often cited as being the first one. So we've really lived through a big sea change, through the pandemic. A lot of organisations have sprung up. You're looking at almost 100 suppliers offering different flavours of the solution, but there is a bit more to the story. I mean, when to scratch below the surface, you do have those organisations, the pure play suppliers who've done very well through the pandemic, and those guys, they're probably trading at around about 200 million collectively. So that's actually not bad from being a kind of esoteric left field solution that's 2 or 3 years ago people were kind of puzzled and scratching their heads as what's it all about. But those organisations and others have taken a lot of the pioneer pain, trying to deliver a service transition from traditional exam delivery to remote proctoring. We've talked about the messaging side of things, but also the risk profile of exam delivery. The risks of delivering something on a desk on paper are very different to on screen. Pushing that responsibility to the candidates that we've talked about. But the traditional suppliers are still in that mix. What I find interesting when you look at those public domain numbers for the traditional suppliers who've managed to pivot, not all of their exam volume has gone on to remote invigilation. It's between 13 and 18% in terms of that transition, which is interesting. Now, for some candidates, finding a place at home for remote invigilation is a complete non-starter. It could be a busy family home with young children. It could be a home of multiple application, or you've got a geography that's internet challenged. Those candidate bases are still wanting a traditional test centre solution. So it's not for everybody. And I think we're only really at the tip of the iceberg for a lot of movement towards remote proctoring. And again, that's probably a symptom of the sector and the suppliers not doing a great job, or could do a better job in articulating what you need to do and what that looks like for the end user. So it is it's a totally different service encounter. We've just seen there's a high-profile European supplier that was sold to a British arm of a US supplier in the higher education space. And when you read about those companies and you talk to their customers, absolutely, they've done a fair job and they're doing a fair job, but could they do better? I guess that's something that the new owners are going to be thinking about. It's remote invigilation, remote proctoring's grown despite a lot of the supplier behaviour, despite a lot of things that have gone on. In education, their clients and the learners, and for organisations and people who've got the monetary backing to invest in EdTech and assessment, they're going to be looking at that to say, well, what could be done better? Are we reaching the right people that we need to? And that investment side is something really, really interesting to talk about. So for acquiring companies or venture capital or private equity houses, it's not always about backing an already successful winner. A good acquirer will understand the addressable markets, the scale, the back office, the product lines, if the management are high performing. Obviously, no, don't get me wrong, some will just flip for a quick profit. That does go on. But others who want to invest will try and bring in expertise and financing to increase the value of what they're doing. And I said before, we've seen that happen in Europe. There's also a software company I can think of which they brought in experienced private equity backing, not just to pay for revenue growth, but to enhance the management from an unrelated sector. So they identify that, it's a good product, but the management could do with turning up a couple of notches. And the acquired and the acquiring companies were in different assessment spaces and approach the market in very different ways, but very complementary ways in some respects. So it's understanding that, they're doing great, but they could be doing better, and getting that outside expertise in. That's the kind of sweet spot, really, where you've got those slightly different approaches, but it's complementary, but there's still headroom for improvement. You see this in the membership space as well. I mean, it's adjacent and overlapping with assessment. I talked before about a membership body trying to be the voice of their industry and being international. In the last couple of years, a US private equity house has been conducting what's called a roll-up. So a roll-up is where they consider what services a market requires and they buy businesses to fit into that jigsaw, if you will. So in the roll-up, back office and IT becomes shared, and the brands that resonate are kept, and the brands that don't are quietly sunsetted, and the IP is supported as well. So those organisations invest, but understand what basket of services the membership bodies or the exam owners actually require. And I think that's quite powerful. You'll see a lot more of that over the next 2 or 3 years once we get through the pandemic, where investment companies will understand a lot better what goes into an heady brew, as I always call it.
Yeah, I think that when you look at some of the reactions to lockdowns, which are obviously a pandemic response, that's a very unusual situation and hopefully very much exceptional. So you have this kind of switch fire to remote invigilation, and then a bit of a knee jerk, and you have the delivery done by whatever means necessary. And then we've had, because it's gone on long enough, we've seen this situation where now exam candidates and learners are discussing this and asking for different things. And, they're discussing the kind of the intricacies of the actual delivery and the nuance of it. And then at the same time, you've got, as you're saying, you're talking about investors who are potentially sort of understanding more about exam creation and exam delivery. And it's interesting because it all sort of suggests that what should be happening is thought about the future rather than thought about right now. Yeah. And that seems, from what you're saying, to be a bit of an industry kind of trait, because we were discussing earlier the kind of college admissions scandal over in the States, and the fact that people are or have been able in some contexts to get away with their own sort of individual activities in the background without being scrutinized, because there was no means of scrutinizing them. Getting everybody into an exam hall might not be particularly useful, but using purpose-designed technology in order to facilitate kind of independent third-party monitoring of that kind of activity, even if it is a bit more nuanced, or even if it's very small scale, kind of tutor-led assessments and private exams for, one or two candidates. We've seen that the technology is there now to allow people, whether it's the awarding organizations or whether it's independent third parties, to actually monitor all of these different aspects of the entire assessment ecosystem.
Yeah.
And I think that, you would hope that that kind of greater intelligence and awareness would be something that not only exam designers and delivery suppliers, but also investors might be more aware of the fact that the education technology meets the service providers and becomes something bigger. It always was, but now it's kind of maybe a bit more obvious.
The rub is you're trying to measure something in a standardized way so everything fits in the box. And on the other side, you've got organizations and in lots of places, empowerment of learners. They've got a voice through social media. You look at any Reddit forums, and you'll pick up plenty about remote invigilation. This isn't all about what's on the BBC website or on the Telegraph or the Guardian, the mainstream guys. This is all going on the channels that those learners are used to using, and that's the rub. How do you, as an organisation, how do you engage with that discussion at that level? User forums are part of that. I don't think it's the full solution. I think it's a useful first step, but you're trying to accommodate's not the right word, but you're trying to understand the learners better, but appreciate the demands of a standardized environment, because you're trying to, at the end of the day, create shorthand for does somebody know what they're doing. That shorthand that can be easily understood. And that's probably one of the barriers in terms of articulation, to say we're going to move from a single grade of a 3-hour exam to a deeper and richer understanding of what that person knows, how they're learning, how quickly they can learn, and how are they competent. So I think that's a huge challenge for the assessment sector to wrap their arms around and embrace, to say the learners and those stakeholders are being empowered through the pandemic in terms of remote invigilation and learning from home, and they've had that exposure. They know all the different techniques, but you're still trying to deal with the standardized process that employers and higher education institutes recognise that shorthand. We need to move away from that, in my view. You can look at portfolio. You look at different ways of authenticating evidence from trainers and from different stakeholders. People who are actually involved in that education process. Digitally authenticating that evidence is more powerful. An advocacy statement from somebody to say, John has managed to build this brick wall in a certain way. He's used this technique. This is what it looks like, and then actually having John explained that. I think that's probably more powerful to an employer than a shorthand of a B grade in a certain qualification. I think that's the chasm that we next need to step to.
So obviously we've discussed the impacts that the last 24 months have had on the industry, but what I'm really interested in hearing from you, Geoff, is what the future is going to look like. You know, when things are going back to normal, when we're kind of coming out the other side, what do you see?
Yeah, there's been a real awakening. Exam owners saw the pandemic as an existential threat. You know, if 80% of the revenue is coming from exams, then no exams delivered mean you go bust. You know, it's that simple. So for those exam owners whose learners are in, say, the emergency services or other critical jobs, they still need their exams to go to work. You know, for them, that's non-negotiable almost. So the impact for learners, I mean, this has been super hard for the learners in some respects. I mean, trying to pass an exam is stressful enough without worrying about if you can find a test slot, you know, at a centre. So I think the industry did a reasonable job in trying to turn the taps on, either scaling remote invigilation or, you know, trying to pivot away from test and delivery. But for me, here's what's interesting. I mean, the traditional suppliers were caught on the hop. You know, it was a heady brew of, you know, hubris, defending their real estate, you know, defending their own business, if you like. So you have seen a lot of what I called before the new wave come through and take advantage of that. Now, for the first time, I think you know, through the pandemic, and we'll see more of it, you know, in the short term, is that many exam owners are now turning to innovative suppliers, boutique suppliers that can move quickly, because obviously they've had a bad experience that the traditional guys just couldn't move that quickly. So those suppliers are seeing revenue uptick, which is great, and I think what we'll see in that short to medium term is those guys invest in governance and systems that will level the playing field so that they can present that innovation and present that speed and you know, freshness to organisations, exam owners who probably previously wouldn't have considered that. So that's the kind of short, medium term. I think the medium long is where the investors are now paying attention. So I mean, prior to the last 24 months, training organisations would probably see 80% of the attention with assessment 20%. You know, if you think you come on a garden instructor-led training 4 days and 1 day for the exam, it's not dissimilar in terms of the attention. So I think on the investment side, I think it's wonderful in lots of respects. I saw a webinar by the UK government's trade department on China on Monday, and they commissioned EY and Parthenon to look at the level of financing for vocational education in China. So, just to get some perspective on of what's coming through here, in the first half of 2021, the deal value was about £720 million. For the whole of 2019, it was 192. So that's a 275% increase. What's additionally interesting to that is the number of deals is decreasing. Now you might think, oh, that's not good. What's happened there? There's not enough deals. But it's actually the value of the deal is going up. And if the number of deals is going down, but the value is going up, that tells us that the market's maturing. It tells us that the market and investors are becoming more versed in what EdTech and assessment is all about, which is great. It's starting to look under those rocks. It's starting to, you know, chip away at some of the old crusty things that have always been taken for granted and nobody's ever questioned. So I think it's all good in the short, medium and long term. I think what I said before about that concept of the toolkit, I think that's still a frontier that still needs to be discussed. I think we've just come through a lot in the last 24 months. So yeah, once we've caught our breath, I think that'll be the next place I'd like to go to.
So have we got any ideas about that toolkit and my kind of cup of tea?
Yeah.
You know, where are we going with magic space robots that do exams whilst they're flying around?
Oh, no, I hate the use of robots. Any sort of EdTech PR or it just waters and cheapens the debate.
What examples are there? I'm curious.
Oh, there's one at the Bet Show either last year or the year before, and somebody was using a robot, to do a certain task, and say, "Oh, it wouldn't be great to have one of these?" And that means robots are mates and teachers, and it's just just shoot.
It's a Daily Mail headline right there.
Yeah, it's definitely
it's not helpful to the debate.
That kind of reductionism about this is definitely the solution to that. I think that the trick is using things as complementary tools to help learners do different things, like you said earlier, about assessing somebody who's doing something very manual and physical, and trying to provide evidence of that. I think that it's really interesting to look at some of the virtual reality systems which are now evolving and becoming better than they were. And the very rudimentary ones were a little bit naff in terms of the experience they provide, but now they're beginning to get really quite good. And I read something interesting recently that was talking about how the reality that's presented inside virtual reality doesn't actually need to be ultra high definition, incredibly detailed and so on, because your brain makes the connection for you, and so you feel very immersed, even if it's only 30% resolution. I'm probably misquoting that. And so you can see the benefit in terms of training applications, then in terms of assessment applications. I don't think these things are being used a lot at the moment, because the assessment methodology is still, like we said earlier, quite based on old-fashioned methods.
Wherever there's risk, those sort of solutions are working well, especially in the corporate space, oil and gas and that kind of thing. I think one thing that might be holding them back is the service encounter. Especially given the pandemic, nobody wants to put on a sweaty Oculus that's been through 7 or 8 different sweaty guys that morning. It's how do we get around that? Obviously, there's things like Google Cardboard that's are almost disposable in some ways, but they do the job. So again, it's service encounter, the price point, the availability of that kit. When we talk about simulations as well, I mean, one of the things that has always held back simulation is it accessible for everybody? Or if a trainer can spend 50 grand on a simulator for aviation or for driving, that's great, but that should be made available to everybody so that everybody has an equal chance of passing that assessment, whatever that looks like. So I think there's still some road to run on that. I think what we might see is identity systems becoming more into the mainstream for lots of different reasons, where you've got there's certain UK organisations that now have an app which lets you use post office services, identity at the post office, and they're using them for age checking for alcohol in the retail environment. Once those solutions become mainstream for certain demographics of learners, then I use this to go to the shops or to the post office or whatever it is, or buy something online. Once that becomes mainstream, then we'll rerun that process again that we did for paper to on screen. It's used elsewhere. Why can't we apply it when we're checking to see if this person is who they say they are doing the exam?
I think now is a good opportunity for people off the back of all the innovation of the past 24 months to be really future conscious and to be aware of the fact that time passes quite quickly when you're busy and so on. And we now live in a world where Elon Musk, SpaceX are actively looking to colonize Mars at some point in the future. And it seems quite likely now, when 50 years ago it would have seemed like utter madness. And it's interesting, I was reading as well yesterday about the asteroid that they were talking about potentially landing on. And I think it's really, although it's very sci-fi, considering things and working through hypotheticals, thought experiments about how could people be regulated in terms of professional qualifications. Should they be at an outpost on Mars, living off Earth, as people have been doing for the past, 15, 16 years now on the space station? I think that kind of future thinking can't hurt our industry if it's perhaps a little bit steeped in tradition and perhaps a little bit, or recently suffered a bit of a stumbling block as a consequence of that.
One thing I've learned is that progress is never linear, and the cadence of that progress, it can be interesting as well. I mean, relating to the space program, once we saw man land on the moon in '69, we thought, we'll be on Mars by '76. Yep. But lots of different reasons why that didn't happen, and again, it's quite bumpy and lumpy, to use the cliche. It's I think we'll see that. We've talked before about the blockers and the enablers, and obviously the pandemic's played its part. But there's an interesting perspective of when policy aligns up with what could be done. Now, I think we're starting to get towards that point where moving big swathes of general qualifications on screen was just not on the policy at all. We saw that in the OOs where we were promised all skills exams will be online by 2009. Obviously, that didn't happen because of the recession and malpractice. That was a big issue back then for certain tests. But now it's starting to come back into that window. It's essentially called the Overton window after a US policy person. And I think that change is just about getting into that window. So there'll be an opportunity for lots of organisations to engage with that. And it's a shame because, to your point, Ben, we could have been doing this 15 years ago without too much hassle, in my view. But it's only now where, with the pandemic as a catalyst, it's that policy is starting to get into the sweet spot. To what we talk about short, medium, long, I think in the short term that's really exciting for everybody in the sector, for actually policy and the ability to do something and have the backing from enough stakeholders to get something done. It's something to look forward to.
Geoff, thank you so much for joining us today. If people are interested in hearing more about you, hearing more of what you say, where should they find you?
GeoffChapman.com. That's the easiest thing to do. If you're into Twitter, at Chappersman.
So if you've enjoyed today's podcast, why not subscribe, rate or review wherever you're listening? And you can also read a transcript at www.victor.blog. And please get the conversation started in the comments sections by leaving your thoughts and opinions on what we've discussed today.